Good morning. My name is Misty Allen, and I am here with Catherine Wiegert. We are the specialists in the Gifted Department for Duval County Public Schools. We are very excited that you are here today to learn a little bit about gifted programs here in Duval County Public Schools. Miss Wiegert is here with us. She is not going to be turning on her camera because she's having technical difficulty today, but you will hear her voice throughout the presentation. Also, if you have questions, as Ms. Van de Meyrick just said, you're welcome to put them in the chat box. Myself and Ms. Wiegert will be monitoring the chat box throughout the presentation and answering those questions as we go through. And then we will have a question and answer session at the end of the session. So without further ado, we will get started. All right, so our agenda for today, we are going to talk about common traits of gifted learners. So we'll talk about kind of some of those characteristics that you may see in your child. We're going to talk about the nomination process, so how you or others can nominate a student for screening. We will talk about steps in the evaluation process. For students who meet the eligibility requirements, we will talk about placement and then also program models within the district. So at this time, I want to introduce you to Catherine Wiegert. You will not see her face, but you will hear her voice.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Catherine Wiegert. I'm one of the other gifted program specialists. I do not know why I'm having technical difficulties this morning, but I am. But I am here, and I wanted to start off this morning talking about how would you first start to know or suspect as a parent that your child might be gifted. And there are many common traits that gifted students have. Now, your student might have some of these traits, but not all of them. Or just because a trait is here, if your child does not have this trait, it doesn't mean that they're not gifted. But these are some of the common traits that stand out in gifted students, and also that we look for in the gifted behavioral checklist. So a very common trait of students who are gifted is that they use vocabulary beyond their age. If they're an English language learner, that could be a dual language issue also. One thing that parents often really relate to is that gifted students often have a strong sense of fairness and justice, that if something is not right, they simply can't let it go. And we often, when we're talking to parents, find that parents really relate to that one because that is a gifted characteristic that is not always positive sometimes. Kids just simply can't let things go if they do not see fairness or equity in the situation. Gifted students will ask intellectual questions. Oftentimes they will have answers for those questions, and will provide an argument for questions, even if their answer is incorrect. They have a broad base of knowledge. Gifted students can also be extremely emotionally sensitive. They also have a unique sense of humor, which can present itself again in positive and negative situations. Gifted students will analyze problems and consider multiple solutions. This is the kid that can do the math problem and be like, well, I don't have to show my work, I can just do it in my head. That they can solve things perhaps in a different way than the teacher is instructing. Gifted students will be constantly asking questions. They will maintain a high level of responsibility. They may not always act on that responsibility, but it is definitely part of what we call their mental weight, things that they carry around mentally. This responsibility for both their grades, and again, it will often tie into that sense of fairness, that they see things from a global perspective from responsibility also. This is the gifted student that will criticize constructively. They will absolutely be the kid in the classroom that points out if there's a mistake that the teacher makes. And they can understand abstract ideas and complex concepts. And then the most common one is that they have the ability to learn information very quickly. We find that gifted students will sometimes be bored in class if the pace of the instruction doesn't meet their needs, and can sometimes become behavior problems. So these are not all the traits of gifted students, but as a parent, these are things that you might be seeing about your child that are making you question, do I have a gifted student? Is having them evaluated for gifted services something that you as a parent should consider and nominate and have a conversation with your school about?
Right, if anybody has any questions about characteristics of gifted students, you can go ahead and put those in the chat box now. All right, we will move forward with how do you now nominate your child? So let's say that you were listening to Ms. Wiegert describe some of those characteristics. You said, oh, yeah, I see some of that in my student or my child. You may want to nominate your child for gifted services. So a parent can nominate their own child. Students can also be nominated by their teacher or other people in the school building, and older students even can nominate themselves. But for a parent who would like to nominate their child for gifted services, the way you would do that is to reach directly out to your school counselor. You would do that in writing, so either a note or an email, and you're just going to request that your child be screened for gifted. Parents will then be sent a consent to screen form. So that is a basically a permission form that you will sign and return to the school with a signature, consenting that we do administer the Naglieri nonverbal ability test. You will also you may hear it referred to as the NNAT. So that is a nonverbal ability test. It takes about 30 minutes for the student to take that screening instrument, and they are looking at pictures and answering questions about those pictures. So they're not having to read anything. They're not having to answer verbally any questions. It's all nonverbal. And then students who earn the requisite score will move on to the next step, which is the evaluation process. Now, once you nominate your child, you should receive the consent to screen fairly quickly, and then the school will administer that test within about a month. So, you know, depending on the size of the school and the caseload of the counselor, some are done very quickly after you nominate, and others may take a few weeks. Are there any questions about nomination or how you do that? You can put those questions into the chat box.
Yep. One of the questions that was in the chat box earlier is, what is the current wait time for an evaluation? So as Misty just mentioned, once you sign that consent for screening, that initial assessment, the Naglieri nonverbal ability test, will happen within 30 days at the school. And then if your child earns the requisite score, they are going to then move on to a psychological evaluation, which I'm going to explain in the next slide. And that process can take up to 90 school days. So being identified for gifted is often not a quick process, but we do follow our state and guidelines on that. So again, that screening will happen within 30 days. And then if they do earn that requisite score on the screener to move on to the evaluation step, that evaluation will happen within 90 days. Okay. If your school does not currently have a school counselor, I would just email that request to your assistant principal, and we are helping those assistant principals out with those that don't have school counselors.
Yep. And some of the other questions in the chat was, does this screening happen at the student school? Yes. all of our gifted evaluations would be done at the student's school. So the school counselor or someone else at the school, it could be an administrator, would administer that NNAT right there at the student's school. So there's no reason for you to take them anywhere. If you have nominated your child and signed a consent and it's been past a month, I would just reach out again and make sure that they receive that consent and that you are, waiting on the next step in the process. And can I nominate? Yes, you can nominate your child again. Students may be re-screened every 6 months. So if it has been 6 months since your student has been screened, you can nominate again.
Yep, and for our ESOL students, that's one of the reasons this is a nonverbal ability test. So the same thing applies.
It looks like we have a question. My son was nominated in elementary but not accepted. Teachers kept recommending. Students can be nominated, screened, and evaluated all the way through high school. So we do offer gifted services K through 12, and we'll talk about some of those program models a little bit later this morning. But if you would like for your child to be re-screened, now that is different than the evaluation process, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. But if you'd like your child to be re-screened, then that can happen, like we said, every 6 months.
So I'm going to explain the evaluation and eligibility section because these are the questions that you're about to have. If the student gets the requisite score on the screener, you will then get a consent for evaluation form to sign. But let's say that your student doesn't get that score on the screener. You would then get a notice with your student's score telling you what their score was on the screener and that they were not eligible for further evaluation. But let's say they do get that score. The student is then going to be evaluated by a licensed school psychologist. That will happen within 90 school days of you signing that consent for evaluation, and that is an IQ test. And one of the things to remember is that in the state of Florida, there is a state statute that defines gifted eligibility. I believe we are the only state that defines it statewide via state statute, which is why we must have that IQ score to determine eligibility. So if you're coming from another state, if you just moved here, you might be thinking about how things worked in your previous school district. In the state of Florida, an IQ score is required for gifted services. There is also a gifted behavioral checklist that would be completed by your child's general education teacher. And then they would determine eligibility. So the state of Florida defines a student eligible for gifted services if they show a need for the special program, if they have that majority of indicators of gifted students according to a standard scale or checklist. And in our district, we use the gifted behavioral checklist that is filled out by your child's general ed teacher. And then that superior intellectual development. With an IQ score that's 2 standard deviations above the mean. So that comes straight from the state language. We often get the question about a private gifted evaluation. You can go and get an IQ evaluation assessment through a private psychologist and then submit that review to your school, and a Duval County Public Schools school psychologist will review that evaluation to determine eligibility. So again, once you've gone through the screener and you get that score, you are then further evaluated by a licensed school psychologist. That'll happen within 90 school days. And they're taking a look at that IQ score. And as you can see, we put the language right on there from the state that it needs to be 2 standard deviations or more above the mean. Okay.
Okay, we have a couple of questions before we go on to staffing and placement.
Yep.
If you are having issues with a program at your school where your child's not maybe engaged the way that you feel like they should, then that is something that you would definitely need to take to the principal. So we had a question about that. We've had some questions about the difference between the screening and an evaluation. So the screening instrument is done at the school level. We did have someone mention that their child was not screened at the school. That would have been during a summer screening. That may happen at other places, but the screener is the NNAT, and that is kind of like a pre-evaluation. They have to earn a requisite score on the screener to move on to an evaluation. The evaluation is a full IQ test with a school psychologist. So we'll make sure that we clear up any confusion on that.
Yeah. Misty, we've got another question about whether or not teachers are polled on a periodic basis about gifted students, or is it on the teacher's own initiative? So a student can be nominated for gifted screening from the parent, from a teacher. Some students nominate themselves. And then also as a district initiative, all second grade students in our traditional and magnet schools are given the Naglieri nonverbal ability test in January. So that's called a universal screening at the second grade level that the district does. But to answer your question in particularly about teachers, some schools do send out information requests from the teachers about, do you have any students that you suspect might be gifted so I can screen them? That comes from the school counselor. And other schools don't. And that's one of the reasons that we do the universal screening at the second grade level, to make sure that we capture every student. And is it taking the full 90 days for the evaluation? It can. It all depends on how many students need to be evaluated and how the school psychologist can work through their caseload. So.
Yeah, we have some questions about, can students be re-evaluated? Yes, a student can be reevaluated, but that has to be approved by the team at the school. So if you are requesting a reevaluation, then you would take that to the school counselor. The school counselor would meet with the school psychologist, the admissions representative, the child's teacher, and then there would be a decision made on whether the student should be reevaluated. So not all students are reevaluated, but that could potentially happen.
Mm-hmm.
The IQ test is age specific, so depending on the psychologist, they will choose the appropriate test for the student's age.
How many questions are in the full IQ test? That's a great question. I have no idea. It has to be a licensed psychologist that administers that full IQ test. So that is not a test that's available for the general public to see. Those tests are only accessible to a school psychologist that is licensed. So I honestly do not know the answer to that question.
And there are multiple tests that the psychologists have to choose from. So we have a battery of tests, and the psychologist chooses the one that's most appropriate for the student's age and situation. So we couldn't say what specific type of IQ test is used for each student. That is up to the discretion of the school psychologist. And yes, to clarify, the NNAT is the screening tool that we used, and the IQ test is different. So staffing and placement. So for students who meet the eligibility requirements for gifted, they will be offered gifted services. The parent will be invited to a meeting. where the program will be explained to them, the evaluation instruments will be reviewed, and the scores will be reviewed with them, and then they will then make the decision if they want to place their child into a gifted program. If the parent decides, yes, I do want my child in gifted, then there is a consent for placement form that must be signed before the child can start. So now that we are doing many virtual meetings, the student cannot start until that consent for placement is sent home, signed, and returned to the school. So sometimes that can take it at least a day, maybe a little bit longer, but the consent for placement must be signed and received by the school before the child can begin gifted services. The teacher of the gifted will be present at that meeting, and they will review an educational plan with you for your child, which includes services, strengths, and concerns about your child's education, goals and objectives that they would like to see your child work on during the duration of the educational plan. So something to note that students who are currently enrolled in Duval County Public Schools and who plan to apply for a magnet school as a gifted student, the student must be identified in focus with an active gifted status or have met all the requirements for eligibility prior to March 18th of 2022. So if you are planning to apply for a magnet seat at a magnet school, your child must be already identified and placed, or they have to have met all of the criteria before March 18th. So something to think about as we approach the school choice season.
Yep.
All other students would be considered academically talented in the magnet lottery. Students' gifted eligibility would be reviewed by the EESS department for students who newly enrolled to the district. So a student who lives out of district would have to go through the EESS department for that gifted eligibility during the magnet lottery process.
We have a question about, let me see. Oh, the second grade sweep in January. They will be screened sometime during the week of January 24th through the 28th. Do you get to see the checklist? That would become part of your child's record. So that would be something that would be reviewed with you when they determine gifted eligibility for your student. So you as a parent always have access to all of the documents in your child's record. So yes, you would be able to see that gifted checklist at the eligibility meeting, not prior to that.
We have a question about the scoring of the IQ test. That would be a question specific for the school psychologist. And if you received an evaluation back and the contact information for the school psychologist that administered it would be listed on that evaluation report, and you would want to reach out to them for any questions about the evaluation or how that was scored.
Yep. Okay, elementary school program models. So we have two different program models in our district. We have a full-time program and a resource pullout program. So in our full-time program, that is where your student would be grouped with other gifted or high-achieving learners, and the gifted instruction is delivered in the general education classroom. That means your children's core content teachers would be gifted endorsed in all of the subject areas, and then that gifted curriculum and the gifted frameworks according to the state are going to be embedded into the core content. That program is available in some of our magnet schools, so we would encourage you when you are at the School Choice Expo to talk to schools to ask about how they provide gifted services, talk to the gifted and talented magnet programs and ask how they provide those services, because it's different at each school. And we as a gifted department don't want to speak to someone's program because those program models do change. So one thing I will share with you just as an example is that we do also have full-time programs in some of our neighborhood schools. But these programs change from year to year, depending upon the number of gifted students that they have at each grade level. So some years they might offer full-time gifted in grades 2 through 5. Other years they may only be able to offer it in grades 4 and 5. But currently right now, and again, speak to these schools about what their plans would be for next year, those full-time programs are available in Mandarin Oaks Elementary, Chet's Creek Elementary, Stockton Elementary, and Chimney Lakes. Those are the neighborhood schools that have this program model. Again, take a look at that school choice catalog for the gifted and talented magnets to ask how they provide full gifted services. Some of them provide full-time, some of them do a hybrid, some of them do resource. But our resource program is the most common program at the elementary level. It is a 1-day-a-week pull-out program, and it is gifted enrichment where students work on critical thinking skills, they work on passion projects, they work on a lot of engineering design challenges. And that enrichment is non-graded, which really helps with the social and emotional concerns of our students because sometimes they feel a lot of pressure. And there is a social and emotional curriculum that is used in our elementary, both the full-time and the resource program, that deals with things like anxiety and perfectionism and empathy. So these gifted students are grouped with other gifted students from other classes. It might be a serve your own program because there's enough gifted students at that elementary school to offer the program right there at the school. Or if there's not, they might go to one of our gifted feeder hub schools 1 day a week. And if they do need to go to one of those gifted feeder hub schools, transportation is provided if that program's not at your school of enrollment. And then for our secondary program models, in middle school, the gifted services are provided through the core content areas. So it's full-time gifted services. Students are grouped with other gifted and high-achieving learners. It is delivered in the general ed classroom. So it's the same as that full-time in that program model that we were describing in elementary school. And that would mean that all 4 of your child's core content teachers are gifted endorsed. They also differentiate their core content lessons with the gifted frameworks. And we do have some middle schools that offer a gifted elective. Pardon me. Then in high school, most of the academic needs of a gifted student are taken care of through one of our acceleration programs in the high school level, whether that be early college or ACE or AP Capstone or IB. So the gifted program model changes to be consultation in high school. So whether you're in an acceleration program or you're not in an acceleration program, there is a teacher of the gifted that consults with the general ed teachers on student progress. In the high school level, that teacher of the gifted can provide small group support to gifted students. And then there are some high schools that offer a weighted gifted elective. And again, that changes from year to year.
All right, so we have a couple of questions in the chat box that I want to address. First is about the second grade screening sweep that will happen in January. all second graders across the district are universally screened. So that is something that is going to happen even without a nomination. So if you have a second grader and you are thinking about nominating them, just know that you do not need to do that. The district is already in the process of ordering those tests and distributing those out to each school, and second graders will be screened the week of January 24th. So the school is already doing that. So there's nothing you need to do if you have a second grader. If you are nominating your child outside of a second grade sweep window, so that is any other grade level, then that is when you'd go through the nomination process of reaching out to the school counselor to nominate. Another question we had was how long between evaluation and a student starting services. That varies because first, after they pass the evaluation, then the meeting has to be scheduled. The consent for placement has to be signed by the parent. The educational plan is developed, and then the services can be started. So I would say that can go, a couple of weeks, depending on the program model. I can't give you an exact date, but it should be, maybe within a month after the evaluation is reviewed by the psychologist. Will we get the results from a second grade screening? Yes, it does take some time because we are screening 7,000 students all at one time. And those answer documents are actually sent to a testing center where they are scored by a computer. And then the results are sent back to the district where we process them and send them out to schools. So the getting the results do take a little bit of time for the second grade screening just because of the volume of tests that we're doing at one time. Gifted is available for students starting at kindergarten. So that would be the youngest students that can be nominated, screened, and evaluated, and ultimately served if they pass or if they earn the requisite score in each of those steps.
Yeah. All students at traditional and magnet schools at the second grade level were screened last year. If your child's in a charter school, charter schools, some chose to do it individually. If your child is in a traditional or magnet school and you didn't get the results of the second grade screening last year, please reach out to your school to get those results because you should have received those. If it's an issue, feel free to email Miss Allen and I, and we can help follow up with you.
Okay, other questions about anything we've presented or anything else concerning gifted services?
When would the screening be done for other grades? So again, if you nominate a student for gifted screening, that should happen within 30 days of you signing that consent for screening.
Yep, and we've had a question about transfers. In Duval County, we will review any gifted paperwork coming for a student who's transferring into Duval County from another state or county. So if that child is identified and placed in receiving services outside of Duval County and then they transfer into Duval County, then we would review all of that paperwork and determine eligibility within our county. As far as transferring out of Duval County, I cannot speak for what other states or counties accept. I would just advise you to keep a copy or a record of all of the paperwork that you receive through the evaluation process. And as you transfer into a new school that is in a different state or county, be sure that you provide that to the school so that they can determine if your student would continue to receive gifted services in their school system.
Does gifted have an effect on the magnet lottery? There are some gifted and talented magnet schools that have specific slots for identified gifted students. So I would ask each school that you are considering, if it's a gifted and talented magnet, how that process works at their school, because I don't want to speak to that and misspeak to something that's a school choice issue. But from my understanding, there are some spots specifically for gifted students at our gifted and talented magnets. So I would reach out to each school as we begin this school choice process that's opening up with the School Choice Expo that's in January. Ask each school about that, and they'll be able to provide you with the best answer.
We had another question about when can a parent nominate their kid gifted? That can happen at any time. So anytime once your student has started kindergarten and you want to nominate them for gifted services or gifted evaluation, then you would just reach out to the school counselor and start that process. So you can nominate at any time. Any other questions?
Remade it. Yes, so once a student is identified as eligible for gifted services in Duval County, they will always be eligible. It is up to you as a parent as to whether or not you want them to receive those services, but they will always be eligible for gifted services once they are identified.
Yep, and we have a question is, does it have to be done at the beginning of the year? So no, gifted services, once your child qualifies for gifted services, then they may start the program. So they, depending on the level of your student, like if they're in middle school, then that would maybe require a schedule change. But if they're in elementary and they're attending the resource, then we have students that start at all different times of the year. So once your child is eligible for gifted services, then they would begin receiving services. It doesn't have to be at any particular time of the school year.
Mm-hmm. What's the percentage of gifted child in second grade normally? So just think of the bell curve. We're 2 standard deviations above that average or median IQ. So typically for a gifted population within, it really goes between 5 to 7%.
All right. Well, we want to thank all of you for joining us today. You can see our names and our emails on the screen, so feel free to reach out to us if you have more specific questions or if you think of other questions later after this Parent Academy is over. As we said earlier, it is going to be recorded, so you can access it later at any time for you to rewatch. And you can always reach out to Catherine and I, and we are happy to provide any support that we can.